We've already read a number of Wordsworth's lyrical ballads, and I've emphasized how Wordsworth intended them to be a different kind of poetry. But I wanted, in looking at the preface to Lyrical Ballads, I want to talk a little bit more about how exactly Wordsworth saw these poems as different. In 1798, when the first edition of Lyrical Ballads was published, Wordsworth had been content to call these poems experiments. But with the second edition in 1800, he writes a preface that articulates his theory of poetry in greater depth. He now asserts this theory with a great deal more confidence. The success that the first edition received has made him more willing to hold up his poems as a standard of good poetry. It's also something of a retrenchment of Wordsworth's theoretical position in the face of a certain amount of criticism that he received after the publication of the 1798 edition. In fact, Lyrical Ballads sold pretty well, although it wasn't as hugely popular as Wordsworth might have hoped, and it did attract some fairly hostile criticism. Wordsworth tries to shrug this off in the first few paragraphs of the preface, insisting that he knew that there would be people who disliked his poems, and that those who did dislike them would dislike them excessively. At the same time, Wordsworth was very proud, and some might even say he was a very egotistical person. And it's probably fair to say that this criticism stung him and led him to defend his project as best he could. He also protests that it's not his intention to try to reason his reader into an approbation of these particular poems. He recognizes the limits of his theoretical project. He knows he can't convince everyone, especially just by writing prefaces. And he's cautious about coming off as too preachy, just as he is in the poems themselves. He seems to recognize that it's essential to make his readers feel what good poetry is rather than just tell them. And certainly in his later life, Wordsworth insisted that he didn't care about the theory, but he did continue to write and revise his prefaces in a way that suggests that he really did have a point to prove. As much as he doesn't want to preach to people, he wants due recognition for these poems. So he realizes they need some kind of theoretical justification. To just summarize some of Wordsworth's key theoretical points. Number one, style. Wordsworth advocates a plain style in keeping with what he calls the real language of men. Heightened poetic diction, he says, is only appropriate when it's called for by the passion of the situation, and meter is only justified by its ability to more powerfully express the feelings of the subject. He attacks the gaudiness and inane phraseology of modern writers and makes it clear that he thinks poetry is the opposite of this ornate, stylized language. Rather, he wants to describe incidents and situations from common life in language really used by men, but at the same time, quote, to throw over them a certain coloring of imagination, whereby ordinary things should be presented to the mind in an unusual aspect. He adds later that he's adopted the language of men, quote, purified indeed from what appears to be its real defects, from all lasting and rational causes of dislike and disgust. This seems to be an important qualification. He admires the speech of rustics because they convey their feelings and notions in simple, unelaborated expressions. But at the same time, he feels the need to edit and improve on them through imagination. Number two, subject matter. Wordsworth holds that poetry should not be about lofty and fanciful subject matter, but should be grounded in ordinary life, and it should put us in touch with a universal sense of humanity rather than one exceptional example of it. In particular, he writes about low and rustic life because he claims the passions of men are incorporated with the beautiful and permanent forms of nature. In short, his argument here is that nature is a teacher, and those who live in the country are therefore necessarily closer to its teachings, which he contrasts later with those who live in the city. Number 3, poetry and feeling. Wordsworth famously defines poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling, which is it's a famous phrase, but it bears some unpacking. First of all, note that he says that poetry is the spontaneous overflow, not that it requires or involves this overflow. It is this overflow. So Wordsworth is defining poetry not by formal rules, like poetry has to rhyme, or by its physical existence, poetry is words on a page, but by its process of composition. Poetry is the idea or feeling, not the poem to which it gives rise. In other words, then, poetry is the mind in the process of expressing itself, not necessarily the external product that is thus created. This means that the actual poems that are written may be seen as somehow secondary, degraded versions of that original idealized experience. Poems are secondary to poetry. Moreover, even though this is what poetry is, Wordsworth tells us that it can only be written by, quote, a man who, being possessed of more than usual organic sensibility, had also thought long and deeply. So on the one hand, Wordsworth retains his emphasis on spontaneity and the natural, but on the other insists that this must be qualified. Not everyone's spontaneous overflows are equally poetic. A poet must have a greater sensibility to nature and must also reflect long and deeply on the subject. So poetry is a process, but it's not one that's open equally to all. The poet is still a special type of person. He later adds that these powerful feelings are to be recollected in tranquility until the feeling is recreated. So there's a kind of doubleness in this project. The feelings are not poetic in themselves. They only become poetic when they are recollected, recreated, and redoubled in literary form. Thus, there must always be a gap between this poetry and the powerful feeling, even as this feeling is absolutely crucial to the writing of poetry. So again, Wordsworth's praise of the natural and spontaneous is somewhat qualified. He's not removing the artificiality and artistic nature of poetry, but shifting it to another level. Thus, good poetry is defined by feeling, not by poetic diction, or elevated language, or anything like that. So Wordsworth objects to neoclassical poetry because it lacks this expression of powerful feeling and is constructed not out of reflection, but out of a strict adherence to literary rules and conventions. So he claims, for example, to avoid personification because people don't really talk like that. And he gives the example of the sonnet by Thomas Gray, which is filled with language that does not express any original or authentic feeling. The reference in the second line, for example, to reddening Phoebus as a personification of the sun is utterly conventional and, as Wordsworth says, decidedly out of place in contemporary England. Nobody in England would see the sunrise and say, reddening Phoebus is coming up. But contrast that line with one from Tintern Abbey, where Wordsworth apostrophizes the River Wye as "thou wanderer through the woods." So notice it's not the personification of nature that Wordsworth objects to, it's the way that it's done. Wordsworth's line stems from his reflections on his feelings about the river, while Gray's line is a purely conventional device for elevating the scene, but, as Wordsworth argues, is purely artificial, a mechanical device of style, as he calls it. Notice there are a number of significant targets that Wordsworth is attacking in this preface. Number one, as I've just suggested, neoclassical theory and practice of art and poetry. These neoclassical theories were quite dominant in the 18th century and held that poetry is a craft with fixed rules passed down from antiquity, from Greek and Roman authors who first basically came up with the rules, and now everybody else just has to follow them. This view of poetry defines it in terms of its heightened diction, which, as we've just seen, Wordsworth is opposed to, and argues that the subject for poetry is great kings and heroes, whereas Wordsworth challenges this idea of the proper subject matter, that poetry for him can be about everyday people and should be. A second important target is modern and urban life, which Wordsworth sees as being uniform and therefore leads to a craving for extraordinary incident, which the rapid communication of intelligence hourly gratifies. In other words, because of the high-paced, fast world of the city, everything changes so fast. People are always looking for new things. So this idea of novelty, of the gross and violent stimulants that Wordsworth objects to, comes from this urbanization of life. The city dwellers are out of touch with nature, and therefore their tastes are also corrupted. Number three, Wordsworth attacks popular culture and the Gothic in particular. He complains about sickly and stupid German tragedies and deluges of idle and extravagant stories in verse. He claims that such works typically exploit the feelings of readers rather than expressing genuine human emotion. Again, this ties into the previous point that because people are always craving something new, craving these gross and violent stimulants, that only the excessive kinds of art succeed in this modern world. So he's trying to challenge that and to write poems that are more genuinely in touch with real human emotions. Having said all that, I do want to kind of raise the idea of whether Wordsworth is somewhat self-contradictory in some of the arguments that he's making. I mentioned that he wants to throw a certain coloring of imagination over rustic life, and that he wants to adopt the real language of men purified from its defects. In other words, poetic language ought to sound real, but not too real. He wants to make the life and language of rustics into a fit subject for a middle-class readership. But he also knows that rustics don't always talk in a way that is acceptable to the middle classes. There's a great deal of coarseness in that language that he wants to excise from it. So is this a contradiction? that he's idealizing rustic language, but only insofar as it isn't really rustic? Or is this kind of a necessary starting place for his theory to start by going back to rustic speech as a way of challenging these neoclassical ideals? Another contradictory point is the fact that many of the lyrical ballads exploit the same kind of supernatural subject matter that Wordsworth criticizes. Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which we'll read later, is very much a supernatural tale, and even some of Wordsworth's own poems in lyrical ballads, such as Goody Blake and Harry Gill, include some supernatural elements. So Wordsworth wants to separate his romantic kind of theory from the Gothic, but we might ask whether those two things are really all that far apart. Wordsworth, at the end of his preface, asks the question, what is a poet? And his answer, in a typically masculinist way, he is a man speaking to men, again emphasizing the sameness between poet and audience, but again making an important qualification. Somebody who is endued with more lively sensibility, more enthusiasm and tenderness, who has a greater knowledge of human nature and a more comprehensive soul. So that's kind of a big qualification. It's as if Wordsworth is saying a poet is a person just like anybody else, just someone who's better in every possible way. And so Wordsworth's emphasis is that the poet differs not in kind but in degree, which is, again, we might ask whether that's a valid explanation, or does it remain problematic that Wordsworth is trying to base his aesthetic on the common person, but is constantly trying to distinguish the poet from that common person. Wordsworth's definition of the poet is thus one that is physically and sensually engaged in the natural world and in rural life. It's not a purely theoretical knowledge that he communicates. Moreover, it's essential that the poet take an active pleasure in this experience. Poetry should be a joyful, passionate encounter, not a dry intellectual exercise. Again, Wordsworth is consciously targeting the neoclassical definition of the poet as an intellectual who has gained learning from books. The qualifications for being a poet are not gained from education, but from an innate receptive quality and the capacity for reflection. This elevation for Wordsworth justifies the principles of selection in the description of rustic life. But it also means that there's a gap that has to be traversed in the representation of rural life. As Wordsworth says, it will be the wish of the poet to bring his feelings near to those of the persons whose feelings he describes, nay, for short spaces of time, perhaps to let himself slip into an entire delusion and even confound and identify his own feelings with theirs. We might ask whether this is a reasonable goal for the poet, or is this a problematic or dangerous definition of poetry as the forgetting of distance between self and other, between the poet and and the audience. So Wordsworth argues that the poet is a translator of passion into language, one who substitutes excellence in language for the unattainable passion itself. That Wordsworth claims that passion itself is an unrepresentable kind of otherness, but the poet simply comes as close as possible to giving it representation. So to sum up, the question that I want to leave you with is whether you feel this theoretical outline adequately expresses what Wordsworth is doing in the poems that you've read, or whether you think there might be still a significant difference between the theory and the practice.